السلام عليكم ورحمة الله وبركاته. بسم الله والحمد لله.
I'll introduce you and then you can begin.
Okay.
Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullah. Sorry to cut off the Shaykh. I'm just going to introduce him briefly and then I'll hand it over to him. Alhamdulillah, the Al-Qasim Colleges welcomes you all to these lecture series. We have today with us Dr. Shaykh Ahmad Arafat. Alhamdulillah, he graduated as a valedictorian of his class from al-Azhar University in Cairo. And in 2014, he received his master's degree from the Divinity School at University of Chicago. And last August, alhamdulillah, he received his PhD from the Divinity School at the University of Chicago. His talk is titled The Kalam Reading of the Surah in al-Rāzī's Tafsīr, a medium for discovering the Surah. And I'll hand it over to him, inshallah.
Allah يجزيك الخير. Thank you very much. السلام عليكم ورحمة الله وبركاته. بسم الله والحمد لله والصلاة والسلام على سيدنا رسول الله وعلى آله وصحبه ومن والاه واتبع هداه وبعد. Thank you very much for the invitation. And thank you very much for coming. This talk is mainly about the Kalam reading of the Surah in al-Rāzī's Tafsīr. And this raises the question, does the Surah have a literary discernible design? In modern Western scholarship, there is a growing interest in studying the Surah as a unified composition. And many scholars have done a lot of research on this. Actually, different approaches and different methodologies would now lead to the same conclusion, that the Surah has a literary design. Many references that will not be able to go through now, but these are some examples of these modern works on the literary design of the Surah. As you see, different methodologies were used, but this is mainly about the Meccan surahs. Some scholars also talk about the Medinan surahs as exhibiting a unified composition, as you see in the book by Michael Cooper's The Banquet, a reading of the 5th surah of the Quran. He's applying the Semitic rhetoric to explain the composition of the Quranic surah. And this is the case of Surah Al-Ma'idah, which some might see as disjointed. But again, the point is, in modern scholarship in the West, there is a growing interest in that. Now, what about Arabic scholarship? Yes, in modern times, also Arabic scholarship has produced a lot of works on the coherence of the surah. Maybe one of the most important works is the work by Muhammad Abdullah Diraz in his An-Naba al-Azim. This is an excellent explanation of the unity of Surah Al-Baqarah, even though the surah employs different topics, but still he finds some threads that connects all of these units together. Is this a new trend when it comes to the Arabic growing interest in the study of the literary design of the surah? Some scholars in the West tend to see the Muslim reactions as the Muslim works as a reaction to the 19th and the 20th century complaints and ridicule of the surah, as was done by some Orientalists, that the surah lacks in unity and coherence. Also, some other scholars doubt the ability of Arabic balagha to provide a medium for understanding the composition of the surah. And this aroused my interest in studying the medieval approach to the surah. Did medieval scholar have an interest in studying the architecture of the surah? And he took the example of Imam al-Rāzī in his Mafatih al-Ghaib, and he found it very interesting that he's really aware of the design of the surah. Sometimes he will tell you what the surah is actually, the whole surah is about, or most of the time, what are the blocks of the units of the surah are about. And he has a specific methodology, but you need to read his tafsir very carefully. To introduce al-Rāzī, let me make a comparison between al-Zamakhshari and al-Rāzī. because both of them are building, both of them are showing us how to discover the subtleties of the Quranic nazm, or the Quranic arrangement and composition. Imam al-Zamakhshari, of course, comes after Abd al-Qahir, and he adopted the methodologies of Abd al-Qahir in his tafsir, and he came up with al-Kashaf, as you know. Imam al-Zamakhshari believes that you cannot be an exegete or commentator in the Quran unless you exceed in the two major branches of balagha, and that is ilm al-bayan and ilm al-ma'ani. So in order to be an accepted exegete, you must master balagha. Without this, you cannot understand or comprehend the subtleties of the Quranic composition or the subtleties of the Quranic arrangement. Now, I do not want this comparison to be different methodologies and different approaches, because al-Rāzī is still adopting the methodology of al-Zamakhshari and quoting him and commenting him and have some observations about him. But al-Rāzī added something very important to unlocking the subtleties of the Quranic composition. And he said very clearly, أكثر لطائف القرآن مودعة في الترتيبات والروابط. Most of the subtleties of the Quran are located in its arrangement and its connections. And here he's referring to the flow of the verses and the flow of the units within a surah. So that is a new approach, or you can say another perspective he's adding to the study of the Quranic nazm. So many scholars, even in Arabic, argue that al-Rāzī made balagha very rigid, because he turned it into like mathematical equations, especially when he summarized Abd al-Qahir's works in his book نهاية الإيجاز في دراية الإعجاز. This book is a summary of Abd al-Qahir's works, and you can see that it is very rigid, and this is true, but we do not want to get to why he did that. Al-Rāzī's balagha is in his tafsir. It's not in his summary of Abd al-Qahir's works. And this is an important note. His real balagha can be gained from his own tafsir, as we understand al-Zamakhshari's balagha from his own tafsir. So you need to understand that balagha is not only gained from balagha works. Balagha could be found in tafsir works. I mean, your balagha theories can be in Quran works. So al-Rāzī here is adding another perspective to the study of the Quranic composition, and he's saying, I can unlock the subtleties of the Quranic composition and provide better understanding by trying to figure out the logic behind the flow of the verses and the flow of the units. He even said, these subtleties لا يمكن فهمها إلا بعد إتقان علم الأصول. These subtleties of the Quranic nazm cannot be understood unless you master rational theology. So al-Zamakhshari is focusing on Arabic balagha. Al-Rāzī is adding rational theology to understand the complexity of the Quranic composition. And he's saying, وأقول لا يبعد أن يصير علم الأصول العقل قاهرا في تفسير كتاب الله تعالى. It is not an exaggeration to say that mastering rational theology is very authoritative when it comes to the interpretation of the Quran. And anyone who has a natural disposition towards these sciences will know that the Quran is arranged in the best way. So I just gave you these quotes to understand what is motivating al-Rāzī's understanding of the Quranic arrangement of the surah. Now, I read the tafsir very closely, and I found that al-Rāzī is having some premises about the surah. First of all, he built or established a strong case that the surah is a dialectical text. And because the surah is a dialectical text, and it has theological objectives and persuasive techniques, this surah, in order to understand its flow, it requires a theologian-exegete, not just a person engaged in balagha. And also another note that he discovered with reference to the nazm of the surah, and this is what everyone could really agree on. The surah employs intentional taṣrīf. Taṣrīf is variegated topics. This is something that many people complain about when they read the Quran. The Quran is jumping from one topic to another. But to al-Rāzī, this is intentional and it has a persuasive purpose. So what you could see as a sign of disjointedness, al-Rāzī would actually see as in line with the Quranic theological objectives and persuasive techniques. So let's see how al-Rāzī builds a case for the dialectical text, because if he fails to do so, he cannot be reading the Quran theologically. So first of all, he does refer to the many types of disputation in the Quran. He referred to the fact that there is a dispute. Allah has a disputation with the angels, as you see at the end of Surah Sad, has a disputation with the shaitan, and the prophets has many disputations with their people. Nuh, for example, his people said to him, قالوا يا نوح قد جادلتنا فأكثرت جدالنا. Nuh, you have been arguing with us for too long. And al-Rāzī would always take advantage of these kind of clear Quranic sentences to say, وهذا يدل على أن الجدال في تقرير الدلائل وإزالة الشبهات حرفة الأنبياء. This is evidence that disputations for the sake of corroborating proofs and dismantling doubts is the profession of the prophets. So to be a dialectician, to be someone engaging in disputations, this is the task of the prophets. He's trying to establish a case to read the Quran in a theological sense in order to make sense of its flow of text. Because this is the whole problem. How is this related to this? So to him, in order to understand how units relates to each other and to make sense of the surah, you need to understand that the Quran is a dialectical text, and you need to understand how the Quran itself argues. What are the patterns? How to understand the Quran on its own terms. And he succeeded in doing that, as we'll see. Also, he would refer to the experience of Moses, Ibrahim, Nabi sallallahu alayhi wasallam, and how they argue with their people to add more evidence. When the stars grow dark upon him, he beheld a star. He said, "This is my Lord." This is about Ibrahim. But when it set, he said, "I love not things that set." So he's using this to say that Ibrahim is aware of the evidence of a change. Because there is change, then this world cannot be eternal. It has a beginning, and it must be created, and I am looking for the creator. So he's here he's making Ibrahim appear like a theologian. Also, we sent unto Thamud, their brother Salih, saying to them, "Worship Allah." And because of that, they became two parties quarreling, arguing, disputing with each other. So he said, al-ikhtisamu fi din, disputation in religious matters, indicates that disputation in religious matters is true, and it also indicates that we should abandon taqlid, or the acceptance of unexamined beliefs. He sometimes would rephrase the statements of the mushrikun into theological arguments. Even Pharaoh would be presented as someone who has an argument that requires an answer. And he would explain the Quranic treatment of Pharaoh's statements in a theological sense. So he did build that case. One of the most famous verses that he and others used to say that the Quran is dialectical in nature is this verse that comes towards the end of Surah An-Nahl. ادع إلى سبيل ربك بالحكمة والموعظة الحسنة وجادلهم بالتي هي أحسن. Call unto the way of your Lord with wisdom, hikmah, and good instruction, موعظة حسنة, and argue with them in a way that is best. So, according to al-Rāzī, as you know, there are three types of evidence. The dalil qat'i, definitive proofs or evidence. And he said, this is the hikmah that should be used with the philosophers. and then speculative evidence. And he said this is the jidal with the heuristic, people who argue just for the sake of arguing. People who argue for the sake of argument. This is وَجَادِلْهُمْ بِالَّتِي هِيَ أَحْسَنُ. This is for the heuristic. وَالْمَوْعِظَةُ الْحَسَنَةُ refers to the lay people. The lay people who have good fitrah and they accept the faith, and in order to persuade them, they just need good instruction, punishment and reward, description of hell and heaven. This is a way of persuading them. But for the heuristic, he's not as sophisticated as the philosophers, and he's not as having pure fitrah as the lay people. So he's in between. He argues for the sake of arguing. So for those people, you adopt with them jidal, disputation. As we'll see, you adopt actually ilzam. You provide some statements that compel them to accept your argument. And this is what the science of Kalam or rational theology is about. They usually adopt ilzam techniques. What is ilzam? You believe in A, but A necessitates B, so you must accept B. So this is very common in the Kalam tradition. But you might say there are negative references to disputations and argumentation in the Quran. And al-Rāzī brings these ayat as well. And he said, because of the so many verses encouraging us to engage in disputations in support of the deen, we need to make a reconciliation between the verses encouraging disputations and the verses discouraging disputations. And to him, disputations is praiseworthy when it is in support of defending the truth, and it is blameworthy when it is in support of the falsehood or it is used for gaining money and prestige. So in this way, he's maintaining his case that the Quranic text is dialectical in nature. And because of that, the Quranic text, in order to unlock its flow, you need to be a theologian-exegete. But this will get him in trouble because some of the fuqaha would disagree with him. Some of the fuqaha who will not be into rational theology would, what are you making of the Quran? This is a new trend. This is not how we approach the Quran. Or the Hashwiyya at his time, who used to believe in tajseem or anthropomorphic view of God, that God has a literal hand as we understand it in the human sense. So those people were against the use or the practice of rational theology. In his tafsir, you will notice that he will use some verses to counter these challenges and these oppositions. For example, he said, واعلم أن كثيرا من الفقهاء يقولون إنه ليس في القرآن العلوم التي يبحث عنها المتكلمون. Know that many of the jurists say that there is nothing in the Quran that supports what rational theologians are looking for. بل ليس فيه إلا ما يتعلق بالأحكام والفقه. The Quran only includes rulings and jurisprudence. He said وذلك غفلة عظيمة. This is a big type of heedlessness. لأنه ليس في القرآن سورة طويلة منفردة بذكر الأحكام. Because in the Quran there is no devoted surah that discusses only legal matters. On the other side, وفيه سور كثيرة, there are many surahs, especially the Meccan ones, that are devoted to give you evidence and proofs of Tawheed, divine unity, prophecy, and resurrection. And these are what rational theologians are concerned about. And he said, وَمَنْ تَأَمَّلَ, if you really contemplate, علم أنه ليس في يد علماء الأصول إلا تفصيل ما اشتمل القرآن عليه على سبيل الإجمال. He said, if you really think about this, what rational theologians are doing is nothing but corroborating the evidence that the Quran already included. And this answers the people who say, by the end of his time, Imam al-Rāzī repented and he said, I wish I would just dedicate my time to the Quran and the Quranic arguments. Actually, he didn't say that before he died. He said that in one of his greatest books of theology. He said it in al-Matālib al-Āliyah, one of the biggest and greatest works in rational theology. He said the best arguments are those of the Quran. But what we're doing is that we're elaborating on them, presenting them in a theological way, and defending their own arguments. So this is not something he said before he died. This is, if you're reading carefully, this is something he said in his al-Matalib al-Aliyah. There is no contradiction between the Quran, the Quranic arguments, and the practice of rational theology. Sometimes he would appeal to Quranic arguments to say that the Quran is dialectical in nature, and jurists who abandon rational theology are having faulty stand. For example, this ayah from Surah Al-Baqarah, people worship your Lord who created you and those before you, that you might be mindful of him, who spread out the earth for you and built the sky, and so on. Here, al-Rāzī would say there is a connection between worshiping God and evidence for God. Both are connected. Both are associated together to know that the Quran encourages rational thinking. And based on this ayah, he defended the science of Kalam. Maybe around 16 pages in support of Kalam, just under this verse, if you check it in his Tafsīr. Long passages, many pages in support of the practice of Kalam under this verse. To summarize some of these arguments, he said, Kalam is the root of all religious sciences. Because if you're a mufassir, then your tafsir will not make any sense if you do not pre-assume that God exists. If you're a muhaddith, you pre-assume that Prophet Muhammad's prophecy is authentic. If you're faqih, it is an extension to belief in God and the Prophet. So to establish the rational case for your faith is the root of the sciences. And then he said also that the Quran encompasses the Kalam arguments as we explained. He also refers to the fact that logical reasoning is a Quranic command. And in order to prove that, he would refer to the many ayat like أَفَلَا تَعْقِلُونَ, أُنظُرُوا. So these commands to think deeply, wouldn't you reflect? Why don't you think? All of these verses or parts that closes many ayat in the Quran. Also the ayat against blind imitations of the forefathers would be usually employed to say that the Quran encourages rational thinking. Also, he said, anyone who tries to argue against Kalam is engaging in self-defeating arguments. Because when you want to disprove Kalam, you will provide Kalam arguments against Kalam. It's like someone who's saying, I cannot speak a word in English. That is English, what you just said. So if you're trying to say the Quran does not have rational arguments, your arguments are also rational. So to him, this is self-defeating. Now, the third premise he had in mind before he approaches the surah in a theological way is that taṣrīf is an intentional compositional strategy. What is taṣrīf? Taṣrīf يعني variegated topics. And as I said in the beginning, many people may think that this is a sign of disjointedness, but to him, this is something intentional and it is part of the Quranic persuasion. Al-Rāzī, because of that, was interested in searching for the figures of Quranic composition. We're aware of the figures of speech, but al-Rāzī here is looking for the figures of Quranic compositions. He's trying to figure out that and he did, that there are thematic pairs that always go hand in hand in the Quran. For example, proofs related to the sky and the earth go together. The rights of God and the rights of people would usually go together, and so on. But before I continue, let me give you this surah and ask you to read it for maybe a few seconds. You already memorized the surah, and try to make sense of the flow of the verses. Can you make any sense of the flow of the verses? This is Surah Al-Alaq, Surah 96. The first 5 verses are traditionally known to be the first verses that the Prophet received in the cave. Islam started in the cave. Al-Rāzī, I would imagine him saying, Islam started in the cave. It's about contemplation. It's about thinking. Al-Rāzī would make a sense of this. So this is read in the name of your Lord who created man of cloth. Read, your Lord is the most bountiful. He taught man the use of the pen, taught man what he did not know. And then it says, indeed, man does transgress all limits in that he looks at himself as self-sufficient. Verily to your Lord is the return. What is the relationship between this one and the one before it? There is definitely a gap of time here, because the first 5 ayat are the first incident of wahi. And then it talks about someone who's rejecting the message. This must have been few years after that. So there is time gap. But does this surah exhibit, can we make sense of the flow of this message? Would it still make sense? To al-Rāzī, it makes perfect sense. Why? Because one of his observations about the Quranic text is whenever you're seeing the Quran talking about blessings, then these blessings تستدعي الحب والطاعة والانقياد. When God in the Quran talks about blessings, these blessings are inviting you to develop love for God, surrender to God, and obedience. This is how the Quran argues. You're being blessed, you need to acknowledge it and turn to God in gratitude. Now, when he explained the first 5 verses to say, your greatest blessings is that you turn from the meanest form of creation, and that is being a clot, piece of blood, and you were fashioned to become a rational person, a person who have the faculty of rationing developed, so you can read and you can understand and you can think. And this is the greatest blessings that you have. This blessing should invite you to be closer to God, to develop love for God, and to surrender to God and to obey God. So these are assumptions. These are assumptions about how the Quran argues. When I hear these blessings, when I see these blessings, I imagine that the consequence is developing obedience. But what comes after this is someone who is disobedient. So this is like an irony. Instead of turning back to Allah, there are some people who transgress all the limits because they feel that they are self-sufficient. They forgot these core blessings that should draw them closer to God. And instead, they crossed all boundaries. And they forgot that to God will be their return. And then from verse 10 until 17, we're talking about an actual case of someone who transgressed all the limits and who was against the Prophet and against da'wah. Many of the Mufassirin associate this with Abu Jahl, but it is not limited to Abu Jahl. It's so general, and Abu Jahl could be an example of this. And then the last verse is what your reaction should have been. Your reaction is to surrender and to gain and to be closer to God. So now what seems to be disjointed, according to al-Rāzī, is perfectly harmonious. Even though there is still a gap of time that we all acknowledge, because that passage from 6, the 2 passages from ayah 6 until ayah 18 can never be right after the first passage in time. There is a gap of time here, but still it is harmonious according to the way the Quran argues. So I did identify some of these rules and some of these figures of composition. So one of them is blessing, and you can also read Surah Al-Baqarah in this way, and al-Rāzī did. If you read the section on Banu Israel, it's always blessings followed by obedience, or blessings followed by rebellion. So there is a huge connection between the two. This is one of the ways the Quran persuades people into action. I gave you these great blessings. Why don't you turn back to me? Why do you want to follow the way of this person who rejected his own nature? Because we're designed to be thankful and grateful. So in order to understand the flow of the Quranic text, you need to understand how it argues. This is al-Rāzī's theory in his tafsir. And it does great service for all of us when it comes to reading the Quran. Now, let's move to the Kalam reading of Surah 38. Let's take a bigger surah and see how al-Rāzī is reading it theologically. Here, al-Rāzī is raising an objection against the initial parts of Surah 38. He's imagining, these are not his words, he's imagining someone objecting, making an objection against the flow of the surah, of the initial parts of the surah. I have never seen in medieval tafsir an objection like this. No one would raise these kind of objections in tafsir. He said about the beginning of Surah Sad, someone might wonder, in the beginning of the surah, God presented the disbelieving mockers as being vehemently opposed to physical resurrection and the afterlife, as reflected in the verse, "Our Lord, give us our share of punishment before the day of judgment." Having described this appeal, that Allah Almighty gave no reply. Rather, addressing the Prophet, he said, "Bear patiently with what they say and remember our servant David." And it is clear that there is no relationship between mentioning David, peace be with him, and affirming the truth of the judgment day. Allah mentioned the story of David in great details and followed it with, "It was not without purpose that we created the heavens and the earth and everything in between." Yet it is clear that there is no relationship between affirming God's purposefulness and narrating the story of David, and so on. So this, and then he said, above this all, the Quran described itself to be noble and notable. How could this be? And this is the case of the formation of Surah Sad. But here he's suggesting a solution to understand the structure of Surah Sad. I assume here that it's hard to read Surah Sad now, but I assume you can follow that with your mushaf. Al-Rāzī here is saying a solution to this objection would be reading the surah dialectically to understand that the surah has an argument. What is the argument? The Rāzī is saying, in order to remove this kind of objection and understand the flow of the text, you need to understand a debate technique. What is that debate technique that would explain the initial parts of Surah Sad? That technique is taking your opponent by surprise, catching your opponent by surprise. What do we mean by this? Is Al-Rāzī is saying verse 16 shows that those people are very stubborn. So in order to convince them that there is a day of judgment, they are stubborn. Remember the three kinds of evidence, the one for the philosophers, the one for the lay people, and the one for the heuristic. So those people belong to that kind of category, the heuristics. In order to argue with them, he's saying there is a debate technique that is acknowledged by people who study logic and theology. What is that technique? He's saying, off topic, change the topic, number one. Make sure that when you change the topic, it has a premise that relates to what you were originally arguing about. And then present that premise before your opponent, and they will be compelled to accept the argument. Because they are so stubborn, no matter what kind of argument you provide to them, they will not accept it. So in order to make them accept it, change the topic intentionally, and then make sure that this topic change have a premise related to the first argument that you want them to accept, and then present it to them. So here the Quran is saying, Remember the story of David. The story of David is mainly about justice. And justice is something that we all agree on as a great value. But justice is not perfectly administered in this life. So there must be a day when justice will be needed, and that is the day of judgment. The Quran uses that moral argument for proving the day of judgment. The person in front of you acknowledge that justice is great, and also justice is not administered perfectly in this life. We see dictators who go with whatever they do, and people who kill millions and hundreds and thousands, they go with it. So there must be a day when there is absolute justice. You might say, but this is not too rational. Remember, this is ilzam. Ilzam, you present an axiomatic statement that the majority accept or your opponent accept. He's not dealing with philosophers here. He's dealing with the heuristic, someone who argues for the sake of argument. So he's changing the topic. And this is actually mentioned in Aristotle topics. The idea of the off-topic is one of the techniques that we find in the book, in Aristotle book of topics, which deals with the dialectical process of forming and refuting arguments. So in Aristotle topics, the dialectician's methods of catching the adversary by surprise are listed there. When you raise irrelevant questions and use these tricks in order to convince your opponent of your point. Robin Smith also describes this when he said, dialectic is a competitive activity, and Aristotle gives due emphasis to the importance of this strategy. It makes a difference which question I ask first. If my opponent sees where I am going, he may try to avoid giving me the premises I need. Therefore, it might help if I put the premises forward in a confusing order, perhaps mixing them in a number of irrelevant premises to conceal my argument until it is too late. So al-Rāzī is saying this is exactly what the Quran is doing. And he said this is the way of the uqala. This is the way of rational people. When I searched it, I found out that this is the way of Aristotle. But again, he wants to prove to you that if you approach the Quran as argumentation, the surah would start making sense to you, and the flow of the text would start making sense of you. So the idea that he would raise a question about the unity of the surah or the disjointed nature of the surah is very rare. I never saw it in any other tafsir work. And then he would provide a solution based on disputation techniques and debate techniques. The techniques is something unique that I did not see in other works. Now, what about the surah design? If you read his tafsir of this surah, you will see that he breaks the surah down into 3 or 4 major sections. From 1 to 16, this is the Quraysh rejection. From 17 to 48, this is from rejection to direction. This is more addressing the Prophet himself on how to handle the Quraysh's rejection. And section 3, the fate of the 2 camps, the believers and the disbelievers. And this addresses the Quraysh themselves to persuade them into actions by showing them the consequences of their beliefs. And the last one is section number 4, is from the Prophet to the Quraysh. And here the Prophet would be calling them to practice rational theology and to practice nazar and to abandon taqlid. Because al-Rāzī will conclude that the reason why the Quraysh has a problem is because they fall into taqlid. And that is why the message that the Prophet would save to say at the end is to encourage them to use their mind and to abandon taqlid. What is the key ayah that al-Rāzī is building this surah on? It is ayah 16. Ayah 16 says, if resurrection is true and the day of judgment is true, we're praying for an immediate punishment now. And he said this shows their stubborn nature. Now, What is interesting here is that we're not dealing with how verse 1 relates to verse 2 or how unit 1 relates to unit 2. We're talking about how verse 16 relates to the last concluding verses of the surah, and the second section of the surah, and the third section of the surah, and so on. So this is very advanced way of approaching the surah. To al-Rāzī, section 1 creates a dialectical atmosphere because it describes those mushrikeen as being in izzah wa ghurur, self-glory and shiqaq, izzatin wa shiqaq, shiqaq descent. Shiqaq comes from the word shiq, which means part. So you're in one part and I'm in another part. You're in one side and I am in another side. So that creates that dialectical atmosphere. Also, they raise doubts about the Prophet's nubuwwah. And al-Rāzī turns it into our argument that has 3 promises. I told you that he rephrases some of the mushrikeen rejections into theological language. He said, their argument is like this. Prophecy is the noblest status. Prophecy is to be granted to the noblest. Muhammad is not one of the noblest, so prophecy is not to be granted to Muhammad. So, but he's discussing the problem here is in premise 2. Muhammad or prophecy is to be granted to the noblest. So he's asking them to define what noble person is. And Muhammad is not one of the noblest. What do you mean by the noblest? And he's arguing that the real sa'ada is your faculty of reasoning, not just your materialistic things or family or money or children, as the standards of the mushrikeen. So to them, nobility is money and prestige and children and soldiers. But to him, nobility is different. Nobility is rational thinking, and he would disprove their statements. It culminates into the mocking request, our Lord, hasten our share of punishment before the day of resurrection. So verse 16 is a central argument in this verse. Section 2 again is about asking the Prophet to be patient and reminding him of the many prophets before him. So what is the relationship between this one and the first section? Is to take these prophets as models. This is a long passage in Arabic, but to take these prophets as models in how to deal patiently with them. How is patience related to encountering this theological problem? al-Rāzī would connect this to the idea of ikmalun naqisīn. Ikmalun naqisīn is one of the tasks of the prophets, perfecting the imperfect. And to him, if you succeed in perfecting the imperfect, you're really a true prophet. And to him, this could be more powerful than performing miracles. As Ibn Rushd said, if you have 2 people claiming to be physicians, and one of them is saying, my proof that I am a physician is that I can walk on water. And the other person is saying, my proof that I am a physician is that if you brought me a sick person, I will treat that person immediately. And both of them did what they were claiming to have the power to do. And Ibn Rushd was raising the question, whose argument is stronger? And to him, the argument from healing the sick is stronger because this is direct evidence. That you're claiming to be a doctor, you treated that person, congratulations. You walked on water, it's amazing, but it is indirect proof because people can say, if you can walk on water, you can do this because this is simpler than this. But for him, the second, miracles are also valid, but the second one is direct argument. So it is clear. So the Prophet must be patient because his job is to do ikmalun naqisīn. And you see this a lot in Surah al-Azhar. And he does give a sophisticated presentation of the idea of ikmalun naqisīn. And that is why in Surah Sad, there are some accusations against Dawood and what he did with the wife of the man that went to the battle, and he's saying all of these are Israeliyat and it doesn't make sense, and all the prophets are infallible, and these are presented as models for the perfect people. How could we think of these imperfect nature? And he's described as being Khalifa, and he gave 10 reasons from the Surah Sad why David is innocent, and all of these are wrong accusations, and it doesn't fit with the flow of the verses. Now, section 3, what is the relationship between section 3 and verse 16? He argues that, again, verse 16 is that demand for immediate punishment. Section 3 is a description of what happens to the believers and the disbelievers. And here he's saying, Allah بين في هذه الآية أن من أطاعه كان له من الثواب كذا وكذا ومن خالفه كان له من العقاب كذا وكذا وذلك يوجب الصبر على تكاليف الله. So this is also a persuasive Quranic way for the Prophet to stay steadfast and for the mushrikun to change their minds after they imagine what would happen to the believers and what would happen to the disbelievers. And he said, وَهَذَا نَظْمٌ حَسَنٌ. This is good order, this is good arrangement and subtle arrangement. We see the word subtle again here. Now, we're moving to the last section, when the Prophet is finally given the chance to address the mushrikun. They are saying, give us the immediate punishment now. And the Prophet now will be having the chance to talk to them. In this passage, from 65 until the end of the surah, it has 3 major parts. One part starting with, I am here to give warning, there is no God but Allah, the all-powerful Lord of the heavens and the earth, and then you ignore it. Al-Rāzī here is saying these ayat that the Prophet now is delivering is encouraging them to use ihtiyat, to be precautious. And this encounters taqleed. Do not take faith slightly, take it seriously. I am warning you. And he referred to the idea of ihtiyat. We usually use ihtiyat, and we remember Pascal's wager. Al-Rāzī mentioned Pascal's wager in his al-Matalib al-Aliyah. He said one of the ways of believing in the afterlife is the precautionary way, al-ihtiyat. If believing in and preparing for the afterlife turned out to be the true school of thought, the true madhab, we would be saved and the denial ruined. However, if turned out to be false, this faith would not cause us any harm, and so on. This also, same argument was voiced by al-Ghazali and by Imam Ali in some of his poetry. But al-Rāzī here is not conveying a logic of fear, but a reason to take faith more seriously. This is the first step to encounter stubbornness and blind imitation of faith. Wake up, take faith seriously, because there is a serious consequence. I am a warner. So he's connecting this to the beginning of the surah. Again, it is how the surah argues, how the Quran argues, that he's making all of these connections. And then he's saying, with regards to verse 67 and 68, say, this message is a mighty one, yet you ignore it. And he said, this is a response to the problem of taqleed and a call for handling matters of faith with a greater degree of seriousness. In his commentary, he said, and I quote him, he said, know that this statement, say this message is a mighty one and yet you ignore it, is an encouragement for rational reasoning, nadar, and dialectical demonstration, istidlal, and a deterrent from the uncritical acceptance of religious views, taqleed, simply because these are highly noble queries. And he kept moving in that direction. So, as I said, the last section, section 4, had 3 parts. The first one is, I am a warner, wake up. The second part is the disputation between God and the angels. And this is about the creation of man. How is this related to waking them up? Imam al-Rāzī is saying this reminds them of the prime purpose of the human creation, to think and be connected with God, and to surrender and not to follow the way of the shaitan, which is the way of arrogance. So this is their problem, the problem of taqlid. And the last section, and we'll close with that, the last section is saying, "Oh people, I ask no reward from you for this, nor do I claim to be what I am not. وَمَا أَنَا مِنَ الْمُتَكَلِّفِينَ." He said, this is again a reminder that to take the Prophet seriously, because his message is characterized by simplicity and lack of complexity, because it is based on 8 rational principles: the existence of Allah, His holiness, His perfect attributes, and knowledge, power, wisdom, and mercy, being beyond associates, no idolatry, exalting the pure souls like those of the angels and the prophets, the judgment day, and forsaking the worldly life and aspiring for the afterlife. This is very simple and very logical. And then the next verse, 87, before the last, this is only a warning for all of you. He said, every rational agent testifies to the correctness and the splendor of these principles. And at the end, it says, in time, this is the last verse, you will certainly come to know its truth. He said, it means if you persist in accepting the unexamined teachings, taqlid and ignorance, and refuse these statements, there will be a day when you will see whether your rejection was right or wrong. So from the beginning until the end, he's seeing verse 16 as the central verse. This is a stubborn request for immediate punishment of the afterlife. And it says to the Prophet, be patient. And it reminded him of the way of the prophets. And it described, and it took them into a panorama of what would happen to them, the consequences. And it left them with a clear message to wake them up from the problem of taqlid and to make them reason well. And this is the way to this is the way the surah was formatted. And his method in unlocking the structure of this surah was trying to understand the dialectical nature and the theological nature of the surah. طيب any questions?
Jazakallah khairan, Dr. Shaykh Ahmad Arafat. I'll open the floor for questions now. Inshallah, I'll start us off with one. You know, the statement made famous by Abu Hayyan, فيه كل شيء للتفسير, and the responses against that. Do you think that it became popularized because of people not seeing the cogency or the kalami underpinnings in his tafsir?
That is true. The al-Rāzī's tafsir, people say it has everything except tafsir, but what do you mean by tafsir? It has everything along with tafsir. Because al-Rāzī sees the book of Allah as encompassing all of these logical arguments. I can, you're talking about around 20 volumes. I can make 2 volumes out of al-Rāzī's tafsir about vocabulary, the vocabulary of the Quran and the origin of the words. I can make 2 volumes on athari tafsir, what Ibn Abbas said, what Qatada said. I can make a good set of volumes on theological observations. So it has every nahu, grammar, and his views on grammar. This is something that is not studied at all in al-Rāzī's tafsir, or that much. So he's dealing with the text, he's using the idea of masail. Every verse has different types of masail and inquiries and questions. It could relate to vocabulary, philology, grammar, theology, jurisprudence, and legal theory, usul al-fiqh, and so on. So he's using the Quran as a fountain of sciences. So how could you say that this is not related to tafsir? But again, if you, I cannot dismiss al-Rāzī as a mufassir because of these statements, because you can get the athari tafsir from his work, you can get theological tafsir, you can get balagha tafsir. He quoted az-Zamakhshari a lot and discussed him and sometimes praised him a lot. And he praised some of the Mu'tazila. He was very sincere. These are different theological schools, but they are right here. And he disagreed with them also on different levels. So I don't take these statements serious. It sounds good, like it has everything except tafsir, but it's not accurate. It has everything along with tafsir, I would say. No.
Also, one other question before I pass it on to the others. Based upon your readings of Tafsir Kabir, there are those like Abdul Rahman al-Muallimi and others who claim that Rāzī passed away before he finished completing the Tafsir, and his students al-Qumuli and al-Khu'i and others finished it. What do you think about that?
Now, this is one of the issues that I also read a great deal about, but I incline towards the fact that what we have is al-Rāzī's tafsir. It is very complicated. Arguments can go back and forth. It's complicated, but I feel based on this style, it is the spirit of al-Rāzī. If we would adopt this style as a way of determining if it is al-Rāzī or not, I see the spirit of Rāzī in most of these verses. There are some surahs that it is definitely, clearly al-Rāzī. And there are some surahs that people would doubt about that al-Rāzī would refer to other surahs that he did. So he would say, as he's explaining An-Nahl, for example, I did this in Surah Yunus. And people would say, oh, Yunus may not sound like al-Rāzī. So I feel that it's safe to say it is al-Rāzī. Yeah.
Jazakumullah khairan. My question is, do you know of any mufassirun before Imam Rāzī who worked on this trying to show any of the thematic or dialectic unity in the surahs, and also if you know of other mufassirun after him, who you mentioned one, but are there others that also worked on this? And
you're asking great questions, mashallah. Now, the mufassirun before al-Rāzī, al-Hakim al-Jushami, Mu'tazilite scholars, Mu'tazilite exegetes, seems to be very interested in understanding the flow of the text and the connection between the verses. He quoted al-Qadi Abdul Jabbar a lot. Al-Hakim al-Jushami was interested in his book is published. It's a Mu'tazilite Tafsīr, al-Tahdhīb fi al-Tafsīr. It is published now in 10 big volumes. And he connects each ayah, the sequence of verses. And he also talks about the theological lessons from each verse. I would say al-Rāzī was clearly influenced by this exegetical Mu'tazilite trend, and he developed it in a very reasonable way. So he doesn't come from vacuum. So he's building on these Mu'tazilite interests because he does quote them a lot. And the people who is quoting, their books are not found now, are lost. So we do not have their books. But he could quote al-Qadi Abdul Jabbar for 1 or 2 pages. That is normal for al-Rāzī. So the people who informed him were the Mu'tazilite exegetes who were interested in the structure of the surah. But because al-Qadi Abdul Jabbar wa Abu Muslim al-Asfahani too, he quoted them a lot in Surah al-Baqarah to show the connections between the units. So I would assume that if we discovered these Mu'tazilite works, you will see a lot of efforts in Quranic coherence, but it is unfortunately lost. Now, the people who are influenced by al-Rāzī, that needs a class, because there are great scholars who adopted his view. And I did include a chapter in my dissertation about the people who were influenced by al-Rāzī. One of them was, surprisingly, the Hanbali scholar Ibn Adil. He has al-Lubab fi ulum al-kitab. This is a huge tafsir. He's a Hanbali scholar, and he quoted al-Rāzī verbatim. يعني مثلا his tafsir is 20 volumes. you can say 5 volumes are al-Rāzī's tafsir. Not only that, he adopted al-Rāzī's theological views. And he adopted al-Rāzī's methodology of countering the Mu'tazilites. This is a time when there was a lot of conflicts between the Ash'arite and the Hanbalites in Dimashq, and after the fitna, and he sided with al-Rāzī. And he used to do the figurative interpretation of the Quran, and he used to speak against the idea of taking these words literally, and he would quote al-Rāzī. It is very interesting. The case of Ibn Adil is very unique. So this is Hanbali scholar who adopted al-Rāzī's views on thematic unity, views to counter the Mu'tazilites, and the views also in Kalam. So this also shows how was the reception of Ibn Taymiyyah within the Hanbali school. This also raises some questions about it, because some people parted from Ibn Taymiyyah in theology and in jurisprudence as well. So Ibn Adil would be a case of that. Many other scholars who were influenced by, I think Ibn Adil is just a case in point. Now,
inshallah, I would like to ask you about, so the categorization of people for al-Rāzī to people of hikmah, people of jadal, and people of maw'idah is the same thing that Ibn Rushd Hafid has in Fasl al-Maqal. And this idea, I mean, especially this clear-cut categorization, do we know Ibn Rushd is a little bit before Ibn al-Rāzī? Do we know how it evolved?
No, I think the earliest I have in Arabic is al-Farabi. Al-Farabi talks about these different categories and what kind of arguments that fits each category. Al-Ghazali talked about that in al-Qistas al-Mustaqim in details. And al-Ghazali celebrated this verse from Surah al-Nahl, Ud'u ila sabila rabbik, and he explained it. Because al-Qistas al-Mustaqim was against the Ismailis, right? There is no infallible leaders to follow. So let's have qistas mustaqim, let's have balanced justice, and that is reasoning we can use to weigh these reports. Because if we're just left with reports, we'll have contradictory views. So there has to be something that we use to weigh these reports with. That is the message of al-Qistas al-Mustaqim. So he discussed this verse in details, almost in the same way al-Rāzī did. So I have al-Rāzī, I have al-Ghazali, and before him al-Farabi. Yeah.
Another question based upon that, in terms of the history of tafsir, we see many Mu'tazili tafsir prior to Rāzī. You quoted Zamakhshari, Jushami, Jubai, Rumani, and others. But post Rāzī, we don't see many Mu'tazili tafsir. Did Rāzī, do you think, seize the mantle of a tafsir bil-Rā'ya from the Mu'tazilis?
I think al-Rāzī was trying to sunnicize rational theology that the Mu'tazilite were interested in. Yani to give you the Sunni perspective of Kalam. Because he did complain. The reason why he's taking this approach, he said, look at Al-Qadi Abdul Jabbar. Every verse in the Quran, he's using it to argue for Mu'tazilite beliefs. So he's complaining about this. And he's saying, we have to defend the Sunni approach theologically as well. But this does not mean that he was not influenced by the Mu'tazilite. He was. He was influenced by the Mu'tazilite. You cannot separate him from that context. He was he sees himself as an authority. He can swim. He can swim. Because some people ask me, can we study Kalam? Is it hard? Can we study philosophy? Well, if you're good at swimming, you can jump in and study. But if you're not good at swimming, it may not be good for you. But al-Rāzī was a great swimmer. Is this a word? He knows how to sort out views and what to adopt and what to reject. So he's kind of authority in himself. He's being established as an authority. And rational theology was taught in madrasa. Rational theology during the time of al-Rāzī was taught in madrasa. So he made that revolutionary approach to the madrasa as well. نعم, you cannot separate him from the Mu'tazilite tradition. According to Ibn Khaldun, the Mu'tazilite production maybe witnessed a decline in the 8th century. I mean, they were defeated, Ibn Khaldun would say. He would say the Sunnah really defeated the Mu'tazilite towards the end of the 8th century. But again, many of their views are preserved in al-Rāzī's Tafsīr. And some of their views are, they did make great service for defending the Quran, as you know, in the beginning. Starting from al-Jahid and al-Rummani. And there was a great interaction between the Mu'tazilite and the Ash'arite. Al-Rāzī, al-Jahid sparked that discussion of Nazm, and then it was picked up by al-Rummani, and then by al-Khattabi, Sunni Muhaddith, and then al-Baqillani, and then you have Abd al-Qahir al-Jurjani. Balagha became like officially Sunni, the greatest works by an Ash'ari scholar, Asrar al-Balagha, and what is the other book? Asrar al-Balagha and ish? Dala'il al-I'jaz and Asrar al-Balagha. And then that work of Abd al-Qahir was adopted by al-Zamakhshari. And then al-Baydawi came to really re-sunnatize al-Zamakhshari. So you see that interaction between the Mu'tazilite and the Ash'arite, the Sunni and the Mu'tazilite. You see that interaction a lot, building on each other, learning from each other, sorting out what can be taken and what can be rejected. For those kind of authoritative scholars, to them it is not a conflict. Was he copying from them? Was he in? He was kind of authority who have the right to side with them at one point, to side with the philosophers. He was rationally independent, I would say, for al-Rāzī. And some people say, but he used to change his opinions, and you can find contradictory views in one work compared to another. Yes, that is part of his independence as well. He can, as he grows, he could change his mind about some views. But the only thing that worries me about al-Rāzī was he's almost into Jabri. He can lead you to Jabri thought. It becomes scary when I read him. It becomes really scary when he would say, okay, everything depends on thoughts. Where are these thoughts from? So khalas, close that case. And he would leave you like this. He does not believe in Jabri thought, but for me, these thoughts are the good and the bad. Why do you assume that you have only one special type of thoughts? You have good thoughts and bad thoughts, and both are available, so you have to make the decisions. So both types of thoughts are there. You do not get only angelic thoughts or satanic thoughts. Both are available. And I think this could solve it for al-Rāzī. I feel humbled to suggest anything for al-Rāzī, but when you read in his tafsir what he says about Jabr, it becomes scary, because he can leave you with the impression that it's almost Jabri and don't talk about these things. Because if you do, you do not know what you're talking about. So this is the scary thing about al-Rāzī. And he's a person who can convince you of anything. No.
Would you say that Rāzī views dialectical theology as being a purely defensive science, or does he think that that man's rational faculties are capable of actually constructing a coherent theology that's in line with the Quran and Sunnah?
Now, this is what he does. This is what he really states clearly, that what the theologians are doing is that we're corroborating the Quranic arguments. But is he doing that to validate his approach, or this is something he's really interested in? This is something left to your own analysis. Because what I learned in UFC is you don't take these statements for granted sometimes. Just because he said, my job is to corroborate, that is not an evidence for al-Rāzī's views. So was he trying to validate his approach and say it is firmly grounded in the Quran itself, or he's trying to use the Quran to validate his own theological views? So both, even when it comes to using theology to explain the flow of the Quranic text, he did the opposite. He sometimes would use the flow of the Quranic text to support a specific theological position. He did that in Surah Yunus. And this is the part on Jabr when he was talking to the Mu'tazilite.
I once saw this Imam Razi's isnad in Kalam, that between him and Imam Ghazali there were two chains, and I later heard in Turkey that they still have some of the isnads in Kalam. So I was wondering, in Egypt, do they have any sort of isnad tradition in Kalam, or do they not have it?
You mean now?
Yeah.
Well, I do not see that chain. al-Rāzī does tell us about his chain that is from his dad, because his dad was also a theologian, that goes back to Abu al-Hasan al-Ash'ari. He does mention that chain, but I do not see that I see that in fiqh and hadith more. I do not see that nowadays in rational theology. I do not have it for myself. No. But usually, when someone gives you his isnad, he gives you the isnad of all of the works he studied. So you assume that theology is included. But unbroken chain of isnad for Kalam, it's possible to find it, but I do not have one. But al-Rāzī talked about his isnad, and that means that it was the case at his time, and it is possible to be the case now. Just because I don't have it does not mean someone stopped me from seeking it. He said, this is Kalam, this is rational theology. It's not taqlid, it's not fiqh. So he feels that it's the opposite of isnad in Kalam is the opposite of what Kalam is about. Now.
Assalamu alaikum. This is probably separate to the discussion, but would you say in your reading, like, there is a development of Imam al-Rāzī's views on Kalam in his Mafatih al-Ghaib versus al-Matalib al-Aliyah? Because, as people say, like, his views changed and developed, and if he had, I guess, unveiled so much on Kalam in his tafsir works, I guess, what need was there for him to write al-Matalib al-Aliyah? Was it because his views had changed, or does he just expand on so many various topics in his final Kalam work?
Now, I do not see that there are contradictions between his views in al-Matalib al-Aliyah and Tafsir, because both works were almost written towards the end of his life. But what I noticed is that his usuli views in the Tafsir are different from al-Mahsul. So he has 3 volumes in legal theory, and because I did study his approach to naskh and abrogation, in his legal work, he's attacking Abu Muslim al-Asfahani with regard to abrogation. In Tafsir, he's very lenient towards Abu Muslim al-Asfahani, and he's saying, the less naskh, the better. كلما كان النسخ أقل كان أفضل. كلما كان النسخ أقل كان أفضل. So the only, because I did not study every aspect of the Tafsir, when I was talking about how this approach influenced his own exegetical views. So this approach influenced his views on Asbab al-Nuzul, Sometimes he would reject asbab al-nuzul and would say, this would be really causing disjointed of the text. I cannot accept it. The text must be preserved as general. It cannot be specified to one person. And sometimes it affects his approach to naskh. So this unity of the surah made him minimize the naskh cases. And that is why he would side with Abu Muslim al-Asfahani, the Mu'tazilite in naskh, and he would attack him in al-Mahsul. I saw that as a trend. And also his interest in the unified composition of the surah prompts him to come up with new interpretations as well. So there was an influence of his approach in his own hermeneutical techniques.
Jazakallah khairan, Shaykh.
Allah yabarak
So
feek.
we will conclude now.
Allah yabarak feek. Thank you very much. Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh.